Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Ventura County Mock Trial Competition Judge and Attorney Scorer Training. This year's case is People versus Crotty. Lee Crotty is a self-described political journalist who runs a very popular YouTube channel called The Right Choice of News. And Lee is charged with 2 criminal counts. The first one is aiding and abetting a first-degree burglary committed by Remy Montoya, and count 2 is an accessory after the fact to the felony committed by Remy Montoya. I always like to include this summary of the top 10 tips for judging and scoring mock trial. Normally I'm doing this presentation with you live, and I would go over each of the top 10 one by one, starting from 10 to number 1. But because of our unique situation this year with the competition and the training being remote, I am just going to highlight what I think are really the most important things. The first thing is just know the rules. If you're a presider, make sure that you understand and know the limited evidentiary rules for mock trial. And if you're a scorer, just be mindful that there are certain point deductions that are mandatory and some that are discretionary. Here's just a brief overview of the trial procedures. That mock trial is a bench trial. One of the important things is for the presider to make sure that you give the 30-second rule after pretrial argument and at the conclusion of the trial before you give a verdict, just to make sure that the students and the coaches have an opportunity to discuss if there are any trial irregularities. And because the competition this year is all done remotely, there are a few procedures that are specific to this year's competition. Just generally, unless a student is presenting, the student and other team members, including coaches, will have their videos off and their microphones muted when not presenting. And for those of you that have scored or presided before, the other thing that's going to be a little different is that no one's going to be standing during their introductions. The procedures this year will be all of the team members and the coaches will remain seated. For those of you that are presiding, please be mindful that the rules require a live or a real background. Virtual backgrounds or other type of profile pictures are prohibited. While there'll be a separate training session on the specifics of using the technology for scoring, for our purposes with this PowerPoint presentation, I just want to emphasize that the scoring rubrics, please review them. You're going to see on several slides, it's going to, an animation pop up to read or review the evaluation criteria or the rules and the guidelines, because that really will help you, particularly in situations where may be close for you. Is this a 7? Is this a 9? Is this a 4? Or is this a 6? Always start at a 5. Every student, before they have said a single word, everybody's average. Everybody's a 5. And then just move up or down in your scoring based upon their individual presentations. The next few slides describe some of the criteria in different scoring categories. But again, please review the scoring guidelines on pages 29 to 30 for more detailed information. In addition to the individual scores for each individual student, you'll also be scoring the team as a whole. It's a team performance score. And that too is rated on a scale of 0 through 10. Please review the criteria, and for each team, you'll also give them a score. As much as we may not want to, sometimes it is necessary to deduct points in a performance for a student or for the team. And here are some specific point deductions. They're required to be made in certain situations. For example, each side is required to present all of their witnesses. If a witness is not called, and this typically happens when the side prosecution or defense, they run out of time, that witness, that student that would be portraying that witness and is unable to do so because there's no time left, that student automatically gets a 0. The attorney that would be conducting the direct examination also gets a 0. And the attorney that would be conducting the cross-examination on the other side, that attorney automatically gets 10 points. So please read the specific point deductions, make note of those, and if the situation presents itself during the round that you're scoring, please make those mandatory point deductions accordingly. The pretrial motion is a mandatory part of the mock trial competition, and this year's pretrial motion challenges the admissibility of statements that the defendant made to the officer while inside the officer's vehicle. It is important to note for this year, because it is a remote competition, that the pretrial attorneys have the option to stand for their presentation or to remain seated when they are giving their presentation and making their pretrial argument. Whether the student elects to stand or sit is not a factor to consider when giving them their score. A critical part of the pretrial motion process is the interaction between the presider and the pretrial motion attorney. Their scores and your ability to evaluate their performance is really based upon how well they respond to the questions. Each pretrial attorney will have prepared arguments. They have 4 minutes to present them. But the presider should interrupt and ask questions, clarifying questions, and questions to test the student's knowledge of the subject matter and grasp of the material. Now, this is a timed competition, so we want to make sure that we aren't taking a lot of the evening on the pretrial motion, but it is really important to ask questions so that the scorers can fully evaluate the student's performance. Although everyone will be in a separate location for the competition, there are still rules regarding trial communication. Coaches, teachers, students, they may not communicate with one another during the trial, and that includes any type of signaling or instant messaging. The rules still say passing notes. I don't know how that would be done, but they cannot pass notes. The only communication that is allowed during the trial is between the trial attorneys by using the chat feature, and then obviously between the trial attorneys and the witnesses that they are examining. And this is another situation where there is an automatic and specific point deduction per score sheet if the judge, the presider, finds that there was any unauthorized communication. No props allowed. That is the same rule each and every year. They may not have any type of demonstrative aid. The only type of evidence or exhibits that are allowed are those contained in the case packet. Let's talk a little bit about the witnesses. Now, the witnesses are only allowed to testify from that witness's own witness statement. And there's a fact situation. Witnesses can testify to those facts in that fact situation that they would reasonably have knowledge of those particular facts. Now, like in the live competition, for the remote competition, witnesses may not wear theatrical makeup or have any costuming that is particular to that witness. So for example, if we have a doctor witness, that student can't wear, a white lab coat and have a stethoscope. So that's just kind of an obvious example, but they really need to wear courtroom attire. Now, typically, witnesses are not allowed to use notes when testifying, and that is the same rule for this year's competition. However, because it is a remote competition, the witness must have the case and official exhibits readily available to them during their testimony. However, they may not refer to them unless and until the attorney that is examining them, whether it's cross-examination or direct examination, if the attorney asks them to refer to a witness, that is the only time they may. So just be mindful that the witness should not be looking at any documents unless and until prompted by the examining attorney. And because, again, of the remote nature of the competition, all witnesses are going to remain in the virtual courtroom. However, when that witness is not testifying, those witnesses need to have their microphone muted and their video off. For the purposes of the mock trial competition, cross-examination is not limited by direct examination. So it is possible that you hear some questions on cross-examination on some topics that were not discussed on direct examination, and that is okay. That is permissible under the mock trial rules. However, there is no cross-examination. I've been coaching for 10 years, and inevitably every year somebody needs to be reminded that there's no cross-examination in the mock trial competition. Another situation where there is a mandatory point deduction is where an attorney who is not the specific attorney assigned to conduct the cross-examination or the direct examination, another attorney makes objections. That's an automatic 2-point deduction for any objection made by the wrong attorney. So for example, if John is the direct examination attorney and Susie stands up to make an objection on cross-examination, that's an automatic 2-point deduction. New for this year, because of the remote competition, attorneys may elect to stand during their presentation or remain seated during their opening statements, direct and cross-examinations, and closing arguments. When making objections, the attorneys must remain seated. If you have scored in the past, you know that during objections, the students stand when they make an objection. So in this particular case, because it is a remote competition this year, for objections, the attorneys must remain seated. The courtroom clerk is by far the most important role in the mock trial competition. The courtroom clerk is the official timekeeper. Again, this is a timed competition. If the timekeeper is off, the competition is off. So the courtroom clerk is required to keep accurate time for both teams, provide time warnings to each side, and complete a timesheet. Now, the defense team may have a team member that may serve as an unofficial timer. That student must be identified prior to the start of trial. For this year, both the clerk and the unofficial timer may use the chat feature for time checks during trial. If there is a difference between the unofficial time and the official time of 15 seconds or more, the clerk and the unofficial timekeeper need to communicate and need to then communicate that information to the judge so that that can be straightened out. Verbal and visual warnings will be given by the courtroom clerk for 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, and then stop. There is no overtime allowed. What that means is that when the clerk holds up the sign and says stop, the student who is presenting at that time must stop. If that student proceeds and the presider finds that that was a rule violation, 2 points must be deducted per score sheet for that violation. Also, because this is a remote competition this year, the clerk will have their video off and microphone muted at all times except when giving the time warnings. We have a courtroom bailiff for our remote competition. And the bailiff, because it is remote, may elect to sit or elect to stand during his or her role. Now, the bailiff must have their video off and microphone muted when not presenting. And keep in mind that the rules require the bailiff, before calling the court to order, to remind the virtual courtroom to turn off all cell phones, and if you're not presenting, to turn your microphone off or muted, and to turn off your video. And here are some examples of the scoring criteria for the clerk and the bailiff. And here's your reminder again. Please review the criteria for the clerk and the bailiff, which is on page 30 of the rules packet, for more information about each scoring category. Once the trial is concluded and the scores are complete, the clerk will time a 10-minute debrief. And really, it's important to try to keep it to 10 minutes. During this period of time, do not announce a winner. Don't share which team you thought did better. Don't give them a score. But the judge, it's fine to give a verdict. Usually the students want to know if the defendant is guilty or not guilty, so that is okay to do. But please use this debrief period to provide the students with positive and constructive feedback. It's okay to identify a particular student if you'd like. But please be mindful that by praising one, you want to make sure that you are not being overly critical of their counterpoint. And what I mean by that is several years ago, I had a student who made a terrible mistake during his cross-examination, and he felt terrible about it. Like, he just felt terrible, and I felt bad for him. But then during the debrief, the presider himself basically made my student feel like crawling into the earth, never to be seen again. In fact, he almost refused to come back the next year for his senior year to participate because of how the presider just really humiliated him. And I don't believe that really was his intention, but it was really bad. And the students know when they make mistakes, so please be mindful that when you are giving praise or criticism, that you keep in mind who the audience is. These are kids. These are high school kids. Here's some additional information to keep in mind for the remote competition, how long we expect each round to last, when you should log in, and when you should or should not have your microphone on and off or your video on and off. I'd like to emphasize how important it is to be mindful that these are high school students. Some of these students may be as young as 13 years old. Some may have never had any type of public speaking experience before. This is a unique situation in that the presentation is remote. So for presiders in particular, please help the students relax, enjoy this experience. You're responsible for making all the decisions regarding the running of the trial, rendering rulings on objections, and making any determination as to whether or not there was a rule violation. In scores, your role is to score their performances based upon the criteria in the handbooks, and also provide constructive feedback to the students. And the students really value that. They appreciate it. And again, be mindful in your comments. This is a mock trial. It is not helpful to the students to tell them how things are done in a real trial, because mock trial is very different. There are special rules. There's limited rules of evidence. So it's not particularly helpful to them to hear about how things are done in real trials. Also keep in mind that because there are limited rules of evidence, and this is in particular for the scorers, there may be an objection that you might think would have been a better objection. And keep in mind that that particular objection may not be one of the objections allowed in the mock trial competition. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you know what those are so that you can score accordingly. For each role in the competition, a student can be nominated for an award. And for the Ventura County Mock Trial Competition, typically awards are given for first, second, and third place in each category. That is each witness, bailiff, clerk, artist, journalist, pretrial attorney for prosecution, pretrial defense, prosecution attorney, and defense attorney. Now, scorers, you are not required to nominate a student, but you may nominate a student that you believe did an exceptional job that warrants special recognition on awards night. On behalf of Judge Gilbert Romero with the Ventura County Superior Court and John Tarkany in the Ventura County Office of Education, as well as myself, Denise Triotola, thank you so much for your time in volunteering to support these students during this year's mock trial competition. And because I'm not doing this presentation in real time, obviously I'm unable to answer any questions that you may have from the slides or any of the information that has been provided to you. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact John Tarkany. His email is listed on the slide, and he'll address any follow-up questions that you may have.